childhood development, neuroscience, public health, adverse childhood experiences, resilience, and social determinants. As public health advocates and researchers, we understand the importance of ensuring social justice as a fundamental principle driving access to optimal health and well-being in communities across our nation. It is in the spirit of social justice that we pursue this effort to broaden understanding of equity as a means to achieve our nation's public health goals. In case I didn't introduce myself, which I probably didn't, I'm Wendy Ellis, and I am the director of the Center for Community Resilience. We are joined by a number of our partners who have been in the trenches with us in this work for the last 5 years to help you understand not only how we connect trauma, equity, and resilience, but really giving you a firm grounding of inequity by design. Understanding that how we see adversity in our communities is not merely a contribution to individuals or a contribution of an individual's behaviors, but also the systems that contribute to both the community context and how that impacts individuals. Now, we understand that these are tough conversations that must occur in our communities, but also in our organizations, and they require a bit of introspection of all of us individually. And so that's really where this tool comes from. So we will talk about that, both that personal journey as well as the organizational journey to get to systems change and how that looks across this country. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that sitting here at George Washington University, we too have been recently confronted with the opportunity to talk about equity, to talk about racial healing, and to talk about racial trauma. Without going into much detail, it is important to understand and to acknowledge that words do matter. Actions matter even more. And so how do we begin to heal when words that have been spoken cause pain? And so this is really that part of that work, but not just to think about the healing piece of this, but how do we also prevent, in the spirit of public health, how do we prevent really injury, emotional as well as physical, to begin to move towards systems change. And so that really is the point of our work. And we are really excited to both have the contribution of our partners from NACCHO, Kim Rogers, who will talk to us about preparing for the equity talk, our partners in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky, Tom Lotman, who will talk about his own personal journey towards finding his voice in the equity conversation, but also how that drives and influences that at the organizational as well as coalition level. And Von Treese McDowell from the Alive and Well communities in St. Louis and Kansas City, Missouri, that talks about real deep community engagement around this issue. At the end of this, Sarah Baldoff, who's been with us with the building community resilience work for almost 5 years now, and we will share our new equity graphic tools that we can use across the country in your community and how you can go about doing that. Now, all of your microphones have been muted, but we definitely want to hear your voice. So please use the chat box function to share with us your questions, your comments, your observations, and we will leave time at the end of this presentation so that we can discuss your questions. So who are we? Well, the Building Community Resilience Collaborative and network of partners across this country have been working to build community resilience by addressing and mitigating the pair of ACEs. And what are the pair of ACEs? That is adverse childhood experiences in the context of adverse community environments. And so this guide, our Fostering Equity Guide, is an outgrowth of the experiences of these communities, as our work together has emphasized the importance of centering equity at the heart of what it means to be resilient. So at the heart of our work is the Building Community Resilience process. And so this process is how we go about systematically addressing and understanding the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, the narratives of our community, and what are the supports and buffers that are in place to help people not only bounce back, but help communities bounce forward and thrive. As we've deepened our work on this, we have understood that structural racism is a large contributor to the adversities that we see in our communities. And so part of creating that shared understanding is so that when we're doing the work in communities, there is, with regard to working with partners, creating this state of readiness. So how do we know who is at the table, how they can understand the work, what are the capacities, what is the system capability that we can bring to bear to address these issues? Oftentimes when we are going through that part of the work, we understand that there are multiple partners that need to be involved that aren't necessarily at the table. So part of creating the shared understanding is also creating that buy-in so other partners understand what is their role in this work. Last but not least is also involving the community piece of this. And this is not to suggest that perhaps we go through those first three wheels there and then we bring community on board, but community is on board from the very beginning. And so we do that so that when we are prioritizing issues, it is with that community voice at the table. We truly understand the lived experience of adversity, but also the wisdom of community that really contributes to the supports and buffers that can be put in place to help communities move forward. So that is really, at the heart of this process. And when you see those call-out boxes, this is what we've learned as partners, what are truly the key components of doing this work across the country. So you heard me earlier refer to the pair of ACEs, and many of you may have seen this tree, not necessarily presented by us, but by others. This tree has actually resonated with quite a few audiences, but this is how we frame our work. That, if you look at adverse childhood experiences themselves, the classical definitions of adverse childhood experiences, they are much like the leaves and the branches on the trees. There's something that we can readily assess or see, but what we don't see are what is in the soil, what is the root cause of the adversity that we see in our communities. Oftentimes, when we talk to our community members, we find that there's a difference in how they have access to these things, these nutrients in the soil that help them not only bounce back from the acute trauma, but actually help them heal and move forward to thrive. And we understand that while ACEs are an American public health issue, that it is the difference in the nutrient balance, thinking about what is in the soil there to help individuals bounce forward. And so that difference is what really brought us to the equity conversation, understanding that there are fundamentally major differences between what some people have to bounce forward, thinking about the quality of schools, access to education, access to jobs, safe and stable housing. And so that's what really put our work at the center of the equity conversation, understanding that it's not enough to be trauma-informed without actually having equitable access to those things that help promote health and well-being. And so when we talk about this equity piece of this, it was also fundamental to us because community engagement is so clear for us, such a key component of the work, is that we could not do this work and go from healing to resilience without really addressing equity, because that's exactly what our communities expected of us. And since we do respect the wisdom of our communities and we respect the partnership that we receive from our communities, that it was important that we use that wisdom, that partnership as a means to bring forward this very important element. So when we talk about the equity piece of this, I want to be clear that while we are very explicit with regard to understanding racial or racism and structural racism as a fundamental contributor to the inequities that we see in our community, because we are such a geographically, economically, racially, and ethnically diverse nation, there are many lines that divide us. In fact, no longer do race, gender, or age inoculate individuals for the effects of systemic inequity, as demonstrated by growing gaps in longevity, educational, and economic attainment that cut across all social groups. As the sobering statistics of the nation's deadly opioid crisis, declining rates of longevity in white women, and rising suicide rates in healthy white males indicate, policies and practices that were designed to hold back people of color are now contributing to a widening disparity in health and wealth in this country and are truly driving adversity across the board. And so with this Fostering Equity Guide, we decided to really break this down to make this conversation and this basic knowledge of the drivers of inequity something that's accessible to whether you have a PhD or if you're a community organizer across this country, whether you're in rural or you're in urban communities. Anyone can pick up this guide and begin their own personal journey as well as their organizational journey toward fostering equity. So the first part of the module, which you can download, they're live on our website now, helps us to understand the underpinnings of structural racism, connecting the policy to the pair of ACEs. Module 2 prepares us for the equity talk. There are tips that we will cover today, tools, strategies that you'll hear from our partners, both in community engagement. And what we will end with today is just an understanding of where this journey starts. But ultimately, we are aiming towards large systemic change, and that requires examining and really working towards equity and policy. And that will be the last module of this tool that we will release in April of this year. So let's get started at understanding how we got to where we are today. This timeline, if you download the first module, is also included in the Fostering Equity Guide to understand the deliberate intent of policy to create an equitable conditions, both in community as well as within systems. And so we use this as a means for people to understand that if we only focus on, say, today's inequities and the policies of today without really understanding the history that contributes to the patterns of inequity that we see in community, that we're really not getting to the heart of the matter. And so we use this in the first part of the guide to really help you give firm grounding to understanding historical inequity in this country, where it began, and what must be accomplished to undo these effects. So one of the inequities in policy that I point to often, if you look at the middle of that graphic, you'll see the New Deal era and redlining. And redlining is something that we do focus on heavily in the guide to understand how spatial differences were created and the vestiges of that which are still measurable today. And so understanding the policy history of this doesn't require a PhD, but it does require a basic knowledge and understanding so that you can begin to understand how those policies, whether they're in the housing industry, public education, or criminal justice, contribute to these community determinants that we see. And in fact, in our work, we don't use the term around social determinants of health because we really want to focus on the fact that many of these outcomes that you see are actually driven by policies and practices of our systems. And so rather than talking about them with regard to social determinants of health, we call them systems-driven community characteristics because they are just that. They're driven by our policies of systems that create these community characteristics. And so when we talk about this, this is what you're looking at as one of our newest tools. We wanted to create an accessible way for you to be able to have these conversations around connecting policy to the outcomes that we see. And so understanding that what you're looking at on this infographic is a national outlook here to begin to understand what does inequity in policy look like. And so I'm sorry, I just hit the wrong button because I don't like technology. So I'm going to get us back to where we were. So with the equity worksheet here, or infographic, this is one that is focused on housing policy and practice. And so understanding how policies and programs subsidized and set in place during the New Deal era spatial patterns of segregated housing and communities, and that also led to and is connected to the intergenerational wealth gap that we see across races. Because when you limited racial and ethnic exclusion to who could own a home and where, that absolutely impacts the amount of wealth, intergenerational wealth, since in this country, the #1 means of passing on wealth from generation to generation is home ownership. So when we look at how the burden of inequity can be measured, it's also that those neighborhoods that have the highest concentration of poverty, the lowest generational wealth, are also the areas that carry the greatest burden of chronic disease, such as infant mortality and shortened life expectancy. So we use these graphics to help prepare, to show the data, but then to begin to talk about the burdens of inequity and what that looks like in a measurable way in our communities. Looking at the education system, similarly, how it is intertwined with the housing policy, because we know that the health and wealth of communities are very much connected to both the wealth that is created in the housing industry, but then that also is associated with the amount of money that is available to our public school systems and how those interact. And so understanding that funding formulas have resulted in this two-tier system of education, affluent versus poor districts, rural versus urban, and how those are connected to educational outcomes that follow those funding trends. And so this is a clear way of being able to connect that place-based inequity directly to the burden of inequity with regard to differential graduation rates and higher education attainment, and then also those personal health outcomes that are associated with that. The last series in the graphics, the infographics, also connect criminal justice policy to these community characteristics and inequity. And why is this important? Well, when we talk about criminal justice, it is also one of those sectors that greatly influence the characteristics as well as the character of a community. And understanding that parental incarceration is a leading adverse childhood experience, particularly for children of color, given the disproportionality in incarceration rates as well as in contact rates with community policing practices. So understanding and being able to articulate that, using that data to then tell the story of inequity is very effective in both the policy as well as the coalition building realm. So this is just to help you reframe and think about putting it all together of how these three systems, housing, education, and criminal justice, really work together to create these outcomes that we see in our community. The blue ovals there are some of the things that are what we call contextuals, and really understanding how these things that are occurring, whether that's racism and discrimination or demonization of young Black men, impact or can sometimes alleviate some of the interactions of policies in across these various systems. So that is where our work is coming from. And Module 1 is really developed to help you gain that intellectual knowledge and that history so that you can be better prepared for the community conversations on equity. I'm going to turn it over now to Kimberly Rogers from our partner at the National Association of County and City Health Organizations, who's been with us on this equity journey for almost 2 years now. So Kimberly, it's yours.
Thanks, Wendy, and hey, everybody. Up to this point, we've really focused on the burden of inequity and why we have to talk about equity in order to build healthier, more resilient communities. And now I want to prepare you to have the conversation. Just like when you sit down to have the talk about the birds and the bees, the talk about equity isn't easy. It also isn't just a talk or a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process of engagement and co-creation that requires us to examine knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors at both the individual and community levels, and then start shifting mindsets. Of course, all of that can stir up a range of emotions and reactions and questions, so this section of the webinar will really offer insight into how to embrace the process and create shared understanding to help you facilitate the equity talk in your community. We're going to start off by considering how public narrative plays a role. Next slide. Narratives are a collection or system of related stories that represent a central idea or belief. They exist everywhere and are created by everyone. Couples often have a narrative about how they met, and sometimes siblings about who got in trouble more when they were kids. These kinds of narratives are simple and harmless and really don't have an effect on anyone. When a narrative begins to shape how people create meaning about the world and their place in it, it becomes known as a public narrative. Public narratives give coherence to group experience, usually serve the interests of a dominant social group, and often go unnoticed, even though they're really tightly interwoven and expressed in policy, mass media, and corporate discourse. And over time, public narratives can become widely accepted as fact, regardless of whether evidence supports their claims. And in America, there are some dominant public narratives that serve to perpetuate inequity. Take the idea of meritocracy, which says that if a person works hard enough, they can access economic power and upward mobility, regardless of gender or class or race. By failing to acknowledge that social and environmental levers also influence opportunity, this kind of narrative masks the fact that hard work will only get a person so far if they're starting from behind. But still, we see this narrative often, right? And it persists, and that's because the idea has been repeated so many times, it's now deeply embedded into our social consciousness. Next slide. Since people's understanding of issues is often frame-based rather than fact-based, the cyclical relationship between framing and narrative has real implications for how issues are understood and responded to in the public sphere. And so, as I mentioned earlier, public narratives are often woven into media and can affect the way issues are framed, but frames can also influence public narrative about a certain issue. And so I want to look at an example of this using the public narrative of white supremacy, which is just the idea that white people and their intellect, ideas, and feelings have more value than people of color and their intellect, ideals, and feelings. So if we think back to the 80s and 90s when crack cocaine use was affecting primarily Black communities, media really, if you look at the left side of the screen, framed the epidemic to paint Black people as immoral, criminal, and dangerous. And that narrative then served as a justification for a very punitive criminal justice approach to solving the issue of illicit drug use. Conversely, if you look on the right side, today's opioid crisis is perceived as an issue that greatly impacts all communities, not just community of colors, right? So even if you look at the opioid nation, an American epidemic, right? This is something that is now being framed as an issue that affects all of us. And as a result of that, a much more empathic tone and response is being applied, which has led to what we have seen today, which is a public health approach that's aiming to heal and rehabilitate people. These two epidemics are incredibly similar, and yet the responses are so different, and again, narrative is a big reason why. The public narrative of white supremacy affected how these issues were framed, and in turn, that framing told a story that then reinforced the public narrative. And the implications of this can extend beyond public consciousness into policymaking. As you can see, even the policy names here demonstrate how opposite the responses were to this singular issue. With the crack epidemic, the policies focused heavily on policing, criminalization, and incarceration. And ultimately, this led to even more inequity as laws disproportionately targeted crack cocaine, which was more commonly seen in Black or low-income communities, while simultaneously levying lighter penalties for powder cocaine, which was more often used by white and higher-income offenders. And so the result that we get is more inequity, right, in the form of higher rates of incarceration and longer sentences for people of color. Conversely, opioid policies have focused on recovery, access to treatment, and diversion. And these are things which keep people in community and surrounded by the systemic supports and the people that they need to be resilient. So there's a big difference there. And this just really demonstrates how public narrative can be pervasive, can influence policy, and can create real and tangible consequences that perpetuate cycles of inequity. But public narratives aren't indestructible, right? To create new narratives that are more inclusive, more representative, and more beneficial to the greater good, we have to confront existing narratives, and that starts by just acknowledging them. Sometimes this will be easy, right? The narrative will just jump out at you. Other times it may be more difficult to spot. In these instances, it can be really helpful to ask these three questions. Is the narrative factual? Who benefits from the narrative? And who is missing from the narrative? Posing these questions will get you thinking critically about how and why a story or piece of information is framed a certain way, which will ultimately sharpen your ability to spot a narrative in action. And when we start to look for and call out public narratives at play, we can bring them into broader consciousness. And over time, just like the narratives that exist today became sort of embedded into just what we believe, the same thing will happen. These new narratives will become more recognizable and create space for conversations that give voice to the lived experiences of people that can counter and help change the old narratives. And finally, here, sort of the last but very critical thing to think about as you head into communities is it's really important to understand the role of identity, power, and privilege. For human beings, our social identities are foundational to who we are. They help us see ourselves in relation to other people and affect how we exist and engage with and are treated by the world around us. And while social identity can connect people, it can also advantage one group over another. For example, dominant social groups are given priority in society, and that prioritization elevates and centers that dominant group's needs and concerns as most important, which bestows privilege or an advantage or an immunity that isn't enjoyed by non-dominant groups. And in turn, that privilege, what it ends up doing is smoothing the way to power, or in other words, resources that, one, can be used to create a comfortable, productive, and healthy life, and two, aren't accessible at the same level to other people. And this happens in every category of identity. With gender, men are the dominant group. With physical ability, it's folks who are able-bodied. And with geographic location, it's urban communities. And so what this really means is by recognizing whether and how your identities have given you an advantage, you can remove any blinders that you have and begin to see that everyone doesn't get to exist in the world the same way. And that's a key step to unpacking bias, because it encourages you to step outside of your perceived reality or any assumptions or judgments you have about others and receive people more openly and without expectation, which is incredibly important to being able to engage people in discussions on equity. And what you see on the screen here is just a few examples of things to remember as you enter community. Acknowledge stereotypical thinking. Make a point to get to know and understand people. Seek out and explore new and different perspectives, and just remain open to opportunities for positive contact. And so here, I'll cover a key tips of what to do when you actually get into communities, and then we'll hear from two people who are doing equity work in communities as part of the Building Community Resilience Collaborative. So first, it's really important to foster a safe environment that allows people to be open and honest. People will undoubtedly, make mistakes and say or do the wrong thing, but those mistakes create opportunities for learning and growth. It's critical, though, to note that safety shouldn't be taken as feeling comfortable or at ease. And in fact, in the Building Community Resilience Collaborative, some of our most transformative growth and learning has come out of feeling distinctly uncomfortable, holding space to feel and respect and work through that, and then emerging from the experience with a deeper understanding and an even stronger commitment to staying at the table to be a part of this work. And of course, achieving this takes time and trust, but it can definitely be done. And then finally, you'll want to be prepared to manage conflict and encourage accountability. As you begin to have the talk, or maybe even when you're just talking about having the talk, you may encounter some moments of turbulence and conflict. Strong emotions might arise or be expressed, or someone might do or say something problematic. And in these situations, it's natural to want to seek accountability, but the way we call for that accountability really matters. When you call someone out, you point attention at the person, which can feel similar to public shaming, which can shut people down and ultimately moves the work off track. But from another standpoint, calling in really points to and challenges the behavior rather than the person, which encourages accountability through patience, compassion, and an openness to the possibility of growth, which is what we have to hang on to doing this work. And so these are the kind of lessons we've learned from our community partners, and we're excited to be able to share their experiences with you. And so first up, we'll hear from Tom Lotman, who is the Senior Director of the Innovation Lab at Learning Grove in Covington, Kentucky. So Tom, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kim. I appreciate it. And thanks to all of you. I'm really honored to be part of this really important event. I want to do three things with you today. One is to share a bit of a personal journey and trying to prepare to make an impact on building a culture of equity. Secondly, to talk about this effort in our own organization. And thirdly, to talk a little bit about why this toolkit is so important. So starting with a personal journey, I think many of us fossils of the 60s and 70s who grew up in the 60s and started careers in the 70s really were impacted by the civil rights movement and other causes of social justice. And I should, as an aside, say that implicit bias is not just about race but can be about gender, it can be about age. So any of my young colleagues on the call, please resist the urge to hit your chat button and type in "Okay, Boomer," and reflect before you do that. So, um, just a thought about where I've come from and kind of the rabbit holes I've gone up and down in preparing to have critical conversations about equity. During my career, I've been involved in a lot of social justice issues, whether it's voter registration. I worked in Cabrini Green in Chicago. I worked in remote Indian villages in northern Canada, and have worked with communities of color here in the greater Cincinnati area. And I think that those of us that have been doing a lot of social justice work are not aware of the self delusions that we create that really keep us from understanding racism as a structural phenomenon and even our role in it. And on this slide, I put a picture of the Ferris wheel, which is visible as you cross the suspension bridge from Kentucky into Cincinnati. And if you look within that, inside the wheel, the black building in the background is our underground railroad museum, our Freedom Center, and a history that Cincinnati played a significant role in. And I want to share with you a kind of aha moment for myself. At the Freedom Center several years ago, I am the president of the board of a hip hop arts organization. I know I don't look the type, and I certainly can't do the hip hop moves that other folks can. But our artists were performing in that Freedom Center. And afterwards, I came out, said goodbye to some folks, and then realized I hadn't ridden that Ferris wheel. So I thought, well, here's my chance. I'll jump on that Ferris wheel. And as I kind of went up and down around in the circles, I found myself at the top looking down at the Freedom Center, and then at the bottom looking up at the Freedom Center, and realizing that it was a great metaphor for my own social justice work, that I perhaps was asking the wrong questions. That the question that drove a lot of my social justice work was, how can I help people who have been marginalized move forward? And it dawned on me that just as the Ferris wheel goes up and down, as did my social justice work, I myself was not moving forward. And so I think the question that I really need to ask before I take on, as part of a team to create a culture of equity in our organization, is not how do I move other folks forward, but how do I move myself forward? I think for all of us, looking in the mirror at ourselves and what it means to be white, what role that has had in our life, is a question we don't ask enough of. We tend to try to look out windows and understand what it means to be a person of color when we really haven't even given one iota of a thought to what it means to be white. So that's kind of the struggle, I guess, that I've been on the last several years, is really trying to understand structural racism and what role we all play in it. So I want to shift to my second point. Next slide, please, Kate, that we can talk a little bit about building a culture of equity within an organization. So just a minute about Learning Grove. Learning Grove is a new nonprofit that just rose up this year as a result of a merger of two 40-year-old nonprofits in the greater Cincinnati area. While we have cradle to career programs, our primary line of business is early childhood education, and we have 21 centers in the greater Cincinnati area. We have about 400 employees, and I suspect we have 400 different ideas of equity, and that's one of the first challenges we face. Um, we have centers in the Cincinnati side of the river that are in um, communities that are quite diverse, that are in communities of minority majority neighborhoods. And then when we cross the river in Kentucky, we have centers in pretty much lily white communities, and even in rural Kentucky, communities where the Klan is still active. So we face a huge variation in what people are aware of in terms of the meaning of equity and an understanding of racism. One of the real benefits we have going or being as a part of Learning Grove is that all of our teachers are encouraged to take the VIA survey, which identifies your primary character strengths. And the vast majority of our teachers, their primary strength is love. So, given that fact, one could, kind of dust oneself off and say, well, they got it. There is no racism in Learning Grove. But I think there's research that paints a different picture. Several years ago, in a study by Walter Gilliam at Yale and his team, set up a unique experiment in which they took early childhood teachers and they told them it was a study of understanding the antecedents of acting out behavior and trying to understand what are the triggers of that behavior. So they showed them a video of a typical early childhood classroom with a boy of color, a white girl, etc. And then with technology, they monitored eye movements and found that teachers, even those who on measures of equity and implicit bias, who were denied any bias at all the teachers, their eyes went to that black boy. So the implicit bias is very real in our field. So how do we begin changing that organization to create a culture of equity? We know from experience that with training, we can impact knowledge sets, with coaching, we can impact skill sets. But the question is, how do we impact mindsets? And I think the answer to that is relationship anchored crucial conversations with a trusted mentor, a trusted supervisor. And I think these crucial conversations have to be around building a consensus in three areas. First, the understanding that historic and current policies they created and they continue to sustain institutional racism. And that's something I didn't understand. That's something that most of our teachers don't understand. That wasn't in the history classes that we took. It was Wendy's work and a lot of the work out of BCR that really helps us understand what that structural racism looked like, and understanding that uh, unlike the belief of most of us progressive, it's not that the system's broken. The system's working just fine. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, with exactly the outcomes that were designed to have it create. So really understanding that framework, I think, is a key part of the conversation. Um, the second issue is having conversations that help us understand that we undoubtedly have implicit processes in our organization that sustain the status quo of structural racism. And by that, I mean, I want to emphasize the word processes, because all of us want to point to policies that are non-racist. You know, we fail to understand that while policy might drive rhetoric, processes drive behavior, and that to really understand the implicit processes that maintain structural racism, that's really important. Um, and then finally, my own implicit biases help to sustain these processes. What role does my experience growing up white, what does that mean for me? And then I know I'm pushing time limits here. I wanted to end with a favorite quote of mine from Richard Rorty. And really, I am asking you to kind of keep this in mind. Rorty said that my sense of the holy is bound up in the hope that someday my remote descendants will live in a global situation where love is pretty much the only law. And I think for us to get to that idealized state, we've got to accept that we have our own personal work to do, not to change others, but to change ourselves. And that's where a culture of equity starts. So thank you all for your interest, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. Next up, we've got Vontrice McDowell, who's the Director of Community-Based Interventions at Alive and Well Communities in St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, Von.
Hi. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for having me today. I am going to speak to how we facilitate conversations around equity at the neighborhood and community level, but also understanding that Tom and other folks have already addressed this, that we are going through this process internally as well as an organization and as a team. Next slide. So before I step in front of the audience, I'd like to share our mission statement as an organization to help folks understand where we're coming from in our work, in our trauma-informed work, and why we find it so important to center equity. And so we activate communities to heal, but we do this by elevating community wisdom, disrupting systemic oppressions, acting with urgency, and leading with innovative solutions. So that kind of explains why we approach the work in the way that we do. Next slide. In our work with institutions and organizations and community, we use what we call the Missouri model of trauma-informed care. And that model has 5 principles for trauma-informed work, and that's trustworthiness, empowerment, safety, collaboration, and choice. But again, as we were on this journey internally, we realized that one key principle that was missing for us from that model was equity. And we believe to truly be on this trauma-informed journey, which I think Wendy kind of already laid out for us earlier, you have to center equity in this work. And so this is a visual that we use when we are in front of our stakeholders to let them know that, yes, we use an existing model, but we have enhanced that model so that it fits our work and it fits our mission, and equity is at the center. Next slide. So when we are defining equity, I know specifically racial equity, there are a lot of definitions out there, but in St. Louis, I guess we can say it's a privilege, but also it's unfortunate that we have to be in this space. But we have an existing definition, which was developed by a local nonprofit, Ford through Ferguson. And if you know our history, this organization came out of the charge from the Ferguson Commission, which was developed after the killing of Michael Brown. And so this is a definition that we use in our region. It's a state in which life outcomes are no longer predictable by race. And what I would like to state, and I'll show some slides that we use again to facilitate this conversation at the neighborhood level, but understanding that it's not my race that creates these issues for me. It's not because I am a Black woman that I am more likely to have issues in childbirth, but it's how I am treated and my experiences because of my race. Next slide. So this is a slide that we developed as a team, and again, as we were on our journey. This slide, when I look at it, we think our PowerPoints, sometimes are just very simple things that we throw together. I don't think the BCR collaborative feels that way because you all put a lot of effort and hard work in your presentation. But when I see this slide, I think of the space that we were in as a team and being challenged by our stakeholders and being asked, how can we talk about trauma in our region and not talk about the impact of systems, history, and racism? And believe it or not, folks are on this trauma-informed journey and can do this work without talking about racism. And to be fully transparent, we did it for 2 years at Alive and Well until we were called out. And I'm just sharing that so folks are on the call just really trying to figure out how will we get there. Just understand that as an organization, we are still on this journey too. We are not fully there, and it takes time. So when we present this slide to our stakeholders, we let them know that if we think about individuals, we think about like an onion, there are layers to individuals. And oftentimes we see that behavior, but we don't always see or understand the communities that folks belong to. And community definition is very broad. It's not just where we live, but where we are with folks where we have common shared interests. And so that can be where we worship, where we work. And we don't always know the experiences that individuals are having in those communities that impact and shape their behavior. But then what about the history connected to those communities? And then at the core, those systems that are perpetuating those traumatic experiences that those individuals are having. And then the circles outside of that shade are kind of, again, fully transparent, represent, I think, some of the dominant identities and experiences that we have as Alive and Well staff. But again, we recognize that not everyone's experience is represented on this slide. And so when we are in front of our stakeholders or communities, we ask them, what speaks to you from this slide when you think about your experience or the experiences of your community, and then what is missing? And then that kind of opens the floor up for folks to kind of share their experiences. Next slide. So when we are doing our work at Alive and Well, we are challenging folks to apply the trauma lens, which means we're ultimately challenging folks to change the question from what's wrong with people to what happens to them. And we can apply that same question and that same lens to our institutions and to our communities, changing it from what's wrong to what happened. Next slide. And so after we've built that foundational understanding of trauma and how it's not just the adverse childhood experiences, but it is indeed the parabases, it is indeed racism and systemic oppression, we let folks know that we're now going to transition into what may be a difficult and uncomfortable conversation around what is happening in our region, what's happening in our state. And what I tell folks when we're in these sessions is to really think about, as we get into this conversation, really think about why. Always ask the question, why? Why is this a narrative? Why is this a lived experience for folks? And then I challenge folks to really think about their comfort. If you are uncomfortable, ask yourself why. If you are angry, ask yourself why. If you're wondering, why are we even talking about this? Why are we always talking about race? Ask yourself why you are having those feelings. And so when we begin to transition into the lived experiences in our region, and we do focus a lot on race and the experiences of people of color, we open up with this piece. And if you look at this slide, this tells us that Black women with a college degree or more are still 50% more likely than a white woman with less than a high school diploma to deliver her baby at low birth weight. And so when I share that and when I explain that, I ask folks in the room, does that make sense? Now, I'm often asking to see if I explained it clearly, and I find the response is no, it doesn't make sense, but not because I didn't explain it, but because it really does not make sense. And so the question is why? What is in the soil, right, if we use our pair of ACEs? that is creating this lived experience for Black women. And oftentimes, so as a social worker, we are trained to think about access, right? Maybe it's lack of access to quality health care. Maybe it's lack of access to food and good diet and quality housing. But if we're looking at a population with a college degree or more, I would assume that they may have the access that someone with less than a high school diploma does not have. So then the questions need to go beyond that and start looking at the system and start looking at healthcare and start looking at how women are treated by the system. But then also, if you look to the right of the slide, the experiences that Black women have. So yes, there are material hardships, but then there's racism, then there's discrimination, and then Black women are more likely to be in multiple caregiver roles. That means that not just raising my children, but maybe looking after my mom or my father or my grandparents as well. Next slide. So then, after we spent some time on that, we transitioned into another issue in our region and in our state. And what you see here, I'm going to focus on that top part, which says Black and low-income students receive longer suspensions than their peers for the same types of infractions. The same types of infractions is where we focus our energy, because there is something, and I challenge people to think about this, what's in our hearts, right? And Tom talked about biases, that's enabling us to treat students of color and low-income students different from their peers. And then if we talk about, often folks say the school-to-prison pipeline, here we talk about the cradle-to-prison pipeline. Our systems, our spaces of education where our children are supposed to feel safe are perpetuating that cradle-to-prison pipeline, because we know if our babies are not in school, then there's a lot of free time and opportunity for them to get into trouble. So this is just a look at how the inequities in education plays a larger part in mass incarceration, which Wendy alluded to as well. Next slide. So when we are going through this conversation, we find that in a lot of spaces, not everybody is on the same level of understanding, but we have folks in the room that they have the lived experience, but maybe didn't have the language to apply to that. So we're helping folks to better understand and also explain their lived experience. But then we want to change policies and practices and procedures. We don't want this to perpetuate, right? And so the framing that we're able to use when we want to apply a racial equity lens, so not just a trauma lens to this work, also comes from Ford through Ferguson. And so I'm sharing this because I think these are three questions that our partners can also begin to ask as we're looking to not just change policies and practices and procedures externally and at the community level, but also internally within our organizations. And first starting with, whom does this decision or opportunity or recommendation benefit? Who is benefiting from this policy? Am I just perpetuating the same racist practices and inequities? Does this decision or recommendation or opportunity differentially impact racial and ethnic groups? If so, then we need to revisit it. What is missing from this decision or opportunity or recommendation that will decrease or eliminate racial disparities? And when I look at these questions, they might sound very simple, but I think they're very difficult for folks. And I think as we begin to ask these questions and we're thinking about changing policy, what I would also add is who's at the table when you are doing it? Because I would say it would be hard for a white man to understand the experience of a Black woman. And as a Black woman, I always say I would never be a Black man or a man of color. So who is at the table to help us really answer these questions? Next slide. So I'm a visual learner, and I know that we've all seen different variations of this that speaks to equity. And I always like to remind people that it's not equality, it's not diversity, it's not inclusion. It's everyone having what they need to succeed, But I like this version of it because it gets to justice, that justice work, which was mentioned in Portland as well. And actually digging in and changing policies and starting to look at equity work, we're getting at the justice work, where we're trying to get rid of the inequities that exist in the first place. Next slide. I also like ending with this quote because I think Kim spoke to it, like, this work is uncomfortable. It is tough, but I think just because we're uncomfortable doesn't mean we're not growing. And I'm a spiritual believer. I think that those things that make us uncomfortable, they're stretching us and they're making us better. And so I'm going to read this out loud to put it out there in the space. One thing we know for certain, this is not the easy path. That would be avoidance. And avoidance will get us no closer to racial equity. The path to racial equity demands time and persistence, risk, and resources. It is a path that we must travel together. And that's it. The next slide has our contact information if you all want to connect. And again, we do not have this all together at Alive and Well. We are on this journey with you all. So thank you for allowing me to even share.
Great. Thank you, Vaughn. You and Tom brought some really great first-hand perspective of what it's like to do this work on the ground and in community. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Baldoff and Wendy to talk about how to use data and visual storytelling.
Hello, this is Sarah. Thank you for having us. We're going to talk a little bit about the suite of tools that we have already available and announce some new ones in this guide around equity. At the very top left, we have the fundamental tenet that we believe in, that the path to equity requires a shared understanding. And Wendy talked a little bit about that aspect today, this morning, earlier. And to get to shared understanding, we have to connect. And that involves connecting with people that we may or may not share identities with, but the underlying belief is that we can get there. There are connection points. And to do that, we need some tools, including stories. We do this through data, and we do this through human stories, real people who have that lived experience. So we have a number of tactics to help you do this. We always say no data without stories and no stories without data, because together they can appeal to both the left and right brain for folks. And how do we begin those conversations? We have a whole range of visuals to spark these conversations. These are tough conversations, but sometimes people don't see the reality. So you have the Paravasis tree that was introduced several years ago and has been literally traveling the world as coalitions come around the table with a diverse range of partners and asking, as Vaughn alluded to, what is in your soil in your own community. On the right-hand panel, you see a more elaborate version of our Paravasis tree that has local data overlaid onto it. And so this is the combination of looking at the adversities in the soil and the outcomes and disparities that we see. Here it's Washington, D.C., but this can be used and adapted to your own local data. It is available on our website, as are all our tools. Next slide, please. So in our new guide being launched today, we have a key, one of several key insights. And this is a fundamental truth that we believe in, that equity is not equality. Now, we know the conversation around equality is essential to our democratic conversation. All are created equal, a democratic ideal. However, when you're looking at policies and resources, design and distribution, this distinction is essential to understand. And we bring to you this example here. We've got piggy banks and we've got families' median wealth and the racial wealth gap in America. You'll see that African Americans on the left, the families have a wealth value of less than $17,000, Hispanic families slightly over, and white families significantly over that. We've got disparities shown here. And this is a visual to show the difference. And wealth here means not just income, it means wealth, the total value, one's assets. Now, if we can switch to the next slide, you will see that equality, when applied, in this case, we're looking at giving families $10,000. There's a band at the bottom there. suggesting adding $10,000 to these families' wealth. Now that you will see here essentially supports the disparity that already existed. So what we know now through this visual, you can see a real world example how this, if we were equally to give $10,000, this serves to keep in place the status quo. How structural racism is not addressed through equality, but rather further cemented in place. And we see the same disparities across generations when we simply think that equality will get us there. Next slide, please. There, in addition to this visual, we have a number of other resources and tools in this guide. They've been alluded to earlier in the session. Inequity and privilege, authentic engagement and how to do it, self-assessments, organizational assessments, planning and executing respectful, effective community engagement, and creating safe space while knowing that you're going to experience some discomfort. Folks will feel vulnerable, angry, all kinds of emotions will come up, but you can, as a coalition of a diverse group, hold that space. We've done it ourselves and we continue to try. And that's where this work is being done. And most importantly, in the guide being released today, you'll see a number of real world examples of folks like, including Von Treese, who just spoke, as well as others from the coalition around the country about how they're doing this work. Q&As, tools, tips, self-assessments. You're not in this work alone. Wendy, I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I want to, first off, really thank everyone for continuing to hang with us for this hour, which is really just a really small fraction of time when we consider it's taken 400 years for us to be able to have this conversation and put this information in front of us in a way that we can all understand and begin to take action. What you saw earlier with regard to the equity infographics were side A. There's a side B to each one of these that actually helps us to begin to get local, to dial down to what does inequity look like in your community, using a number of different sources for data to both visualize as well as give the numbers of inequity to understand and begin to tell the story. I want to acknowledge that there's a question from actually a compatriot, dear friend of mine, Ozzie Davis, who's asking, how do we retill the soil without advocating for reparations, affirmative action, or some remediation from the United States government? And I would say that action first starts with education. And we can't advocate for change if we don't truly understand what it is that we have to undo. And I think that's been fundamentally missing from part of this work, not just to become trauma-informed, but to understand what is the true source of trauma and how intrinsic this is to our built-in systems. And so when we look at how we have gotten to the outcomes that we showed earlier with regard to housing policy at the national level, I think it becomes very important for us to understand what does that mean to your community. We can't advocate at the national level if we don't even understand how we got to where we are within our own communities. So this is an example using Austin, Texas, to begin to understand the effects of redlining and how while redlining began in the 1930s, it is very much still with us. The effects of it is still very much with us today. And so using some data from your own community, these in fact are maps that were published by the Austin American Statesman. There are a number of different places where you can find these maps with regard to how to redlining, and then pair those with public health data, public health maps. A lot of your local health departments actually produce maps when they're looking at their community health improvement plans and targeting specific health disparities that they see. And so when you begin to map, you can look, that area that was redlined in that top left-hand corner of the map actually correlates with where you see measuring inequity at the individual level. So in that bottom right-hand corner, you see that there is where you have in red is a concentrated area of lack of prenatal care that's also associated with a 40% increase in the risk of neonatal death. And so understanding that these things actually coalesce together and were deliberately designed so that not only do you have disparity at a spatial regard, you also have it from an income, economic level, and down to the individual outcomes. That is what the burden of inequity looks like, and you can use these pictures and these data to help begin to coalesce around the conversation of inequity so that we can begin to understand the devil of which we are trying to undo. And so when, again, looking at the B side of the education infographic, again, it comes down to the numbers. The numbers are within the policy. So understanding the differential with regard to, this is an example from Southwest Ohio, Cincinnati, and looking at just comparing school districts around the Cincinnati public school area. And so understanding that the median community income actually does determine, or it does help to understand what is the wealth of that community that then can be drawn upon to help to fund those schools. And so when you have that disparity in wealth, you also then have a disparity with regard to what is being contributed to your average teacher salary, what is the district spending across per pupil. So you notice there's almost 5,000 differentials between Cincinnati Public Schools and the Indian Hill School District. You also notice there's a huge differential with regard to the demographics of those districts. And then, by no surprise, because the systems are designed absolutely for the outcomes that we see, then you see the differential with regard to the graduation rates and the rate of disciplinary action. And so, again, when we're looking at how do we begin to understand and point to these associations that are both in policy but also in practice, using these data, which are publicly available. We don't have to have a statistician on board to be able to pull down these data. In fact, we pulled these from a public resource, and we will be sharing all of these sources so that you can do this yourself. This is a way to begin to foster that conversation around equity so that we can get to some of those questions of what is the solution. And until we can actually understand what is the problem that we're trying to solve, we can't be adequate in really defining the solution. So on the B side of the criminal justice policy infographic, we have also provided a template here so you can understand what would it look like if we got local here in Washington, D.C. to connect criminal justice policy to community characteristics and the burden of inequity. So we use these maps that are from a number of different sources, all of which are on this infographic to give you an idea of where you might find the sources of this. But I think, you know, the quote that we pulled at the top of this one actually comes from the Urban Institute, but I think really does a great job of helping us understand how the layers of inequity really contribute to the outcomes that we see. And so the quote says, the people most likely to experience high rates of violence and heavy police presence in their communities have limited resources, social capital, and political voice. Again, by design. And so when you look at how from the district, from the west side of Washington, D.C. to the east of the Anacostia, you see not only is there a difference with regard to racial concentration, you also see that racial concentration correlates with poverty rate, that also correlates with a differential in community policing. And how do we know that? Because we can see it clearly in the data with regard to the DOC, the Department of Corrections, intakes by ward. And so, again, when you have disproportionate contact, you're going to have disproportionate incarceration rates, and those higher incarceration rates actually contribute to ACEs, adverse childhood experiences for children. In Washington, D.C., more than 9,000 children have experience with an incarcerated parent in just 1 year. And so when we think about what's happened, when we're asking a child in the classroom what's happened to them, take into the context of what's happening in their community. And what does that burden of inequity look like at a measurable level, both at the community as well as at the personal level? Unemployment rates that, again, follow these same patterns as we see at the top. Diabetes and heart disease, life expectancies, all of these things that are tied to that toxic mix of stress that is occurring at the community level because of the burden of inequity. These are ways that we can begin to tell the story using the data, using the narrative of our communities to build the coalitions that actually draw people in as opposed to pushing people out. So now is the time for questions. I want to pause here. There is one question that has already come up, and I want to make sure that we have time for that. Tom Lotman, there was a question that was posed to you by Joanne Kelly that asked, what is the staff assessment tool that you mentioned?
Yes, the VIA survey is available online, free. It's been now taken by over 40 million folks nationwide. You can just Google the VIA Institute on Character, or you can Google Authentic Happiness, which will take you to Marty Seligman's website. Either of those websites will allow you to link to the survey and take it. I wanted to make one other comment, Wendy, just in terms of the toolkit and its importance. I think many of us rely on trauma-informed practice training, especially with regard to how it's applied to racialized trauma. And I think that's necessary but not sufficient. And I wanted to give just a small quote from an article in the last issue of Education Week from two University of Michigan researchers that indicate just how important the toolkit can be. They state, here is the danger. Without a systemic lens, trauma-informed practice can draw teachers' attention to the trauma behaviors that students exhibit, potentially pathologizing children for the very behaviors that research on trauma has illuminated, and then blaming their families for their trauma. Without a systemic lens, trauma-informed practice promotes solutions that are individually targeted, while the trauma that children experience is rooted in systems. So I think, to your point, if we want the right solutions, we have to understand the right problem. And the unit of analysis is not the individual child, but rather the systemic issues in society.
Thank you so much, Tom, for adding that bit there. I also want to acknowledge another question that came from Laura Rowan, and actually this question was directed to Kim and part of your presentation about can you provide an example of calling in versus calling out?
Ooh, yeah, I'm wondering, not to deflect, I'm wondering if, because I believe Vaughn was the one that, was it Vaughn that brought this to us? It might be good to have her share an example, not to put you on the spot.
I can't think of a specific example right now off the top of my head. Okay, so what's coming to mind right now is a fresh conversation that we just had with our youth on Friday of last week. And so we actually do facilitate this conversation with teenagers as well. And when we use that onion slide to explain historical trauma and policies and practices, one of my colleagues shared the story of the GI Bill and how her white grandfather received it and how Black men that came home from the war did not have that same luxury, and how that, again, you all talked about passing on generational wealth and educational opportunities, all that came from that bill, and kind of giving our white soldiers a head start. And so actually some of the Black youth in the room spoke about Black folks wanting and needing handouts to succeed, and we shouldn't be so lazy. And so that might hurt, right? And we want to challenge those thoughts, but we don't want to do it in a way where they remove themselves from the conversation. And so it was important for us to pause for a second and really get deeper in the conversation around structural racism. Another thing they pushed on was, why do we always talk about slavery? So talking about the history of slavery and how it still exists under a different name. So not offending, not embarrassing, not calling out people because of their beliefs and their opinions, but providing the facts and the education to challenge them in a way where they feel still called into the conversation and not excluded. And I watched the youth do this with one another, and it was amazing to have other kids step up and say, I hear you, I understand, but this is actually the facts. And I think that there's a way to do that without hurting folks, even if what they say and they believe hurts, and we recognize it perpetuates the stereotype. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you so much, Vaughn. I recognize we're a little over time, but there are a couple of questions that we definitely want to be able to get to. One was from Katie McClure about, do these data sources work for low population rural communities? And certainly there are a number of different sources that do, particularly like the Bureau of Rural Health has some of these data sources, but we have also compiled a list, and I'm going to hand it over to one person who wasn't on the webinar, but is certainly an essential part of our team, Caitlin Murphy, who can talk about some of the other sources for data, and this will be compiled on our website so that you can go to them as well.
Right, thank you, Wendy. So another question that we're getting that ties into this is the availability of both of these slides and the recording and the tool. All of these, the slides, the recording, and the tool will all be available after this webinar at go.gwu.edu/fostering-equity. We're going to be able to share that around with all participants as well. But just to answer your question, the sources for the data in each one of these infographics will also be available at that URL. And to be clear, there is a template that has ACEs data, and we say ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and there is information that we will provide about how we got that ACEs data in particular. And then on the other infographics, it is data that's from a variety of other sources, and we will point you in the direction of those other sources. So in some cases, there are data points that are from the same specific data source, and in other cases, it's a community by community search to see if you have that data available. Hopefully that clarified a bit.
So thank you so much to our panelists, Von Treese McDowell, Tom Lotman, Kim Rogers. NACCHO has been a wonderful partner in all of this work. But most importantly, thank you for tuning in to this webinar, to being a force for change in your community, an advocate for our children, an advocate for equity. We are here to support that work. That's why all of our tools and our resources are free, available. We're not here to create more disparity. So it is open to everyone, and certainly you can interact with us on our Twitter feed, or you can reach us directly. If you need help in finding specific data sources, that's what we're here for. We are a National Technical Resource Center. We want to make a difference, and we want to help you make a difference as well. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hopefully many of you tuning in again in April when we release our Equity and Policy. That will be the last chapter of this guide. So thank you. Continue to do the work in the communities. Together, we will build a resilient nation.
Thank you.